this video, we'll be discussing whether or not the Broadway Melody deserves to be called the best picture of the year that it came out. Or half year and half year. Which I guess equals a full year anyway, but not a full calendar year because it was still, half and half, but still a full year, and you get the idea. The second Academy Awards is interesting as it is the only Oscar ceremony where there was no formal nominee list. They just said whoever won each category, and that was that. Despite this, however, several scholars have gone back and went through the records of what Academy members were looking at to create a sort of impromptu nominees list. Good work there, guys. According to these records, the Broadway Melody's biggest competition that year was apparently in Old Arizona, one of the earliest westerns that kicked off the Cisco Kid film series, as well as being the first sound film that was mostly filmed outside. In other words, no controlled environment for your sound. This no doubt opened up a whole other can of worms when it came to early sound recording that I don't even want to imagine. The film revolves around the Cisco Kid, played by Warner Baxter, a dashing outlaw who's been robbing people and causing all sorts of problems. So the army sends in their top man, Sergeant Dunn, played by Edmund Lowe, along with a crack team of soldiers to track the Cisco Kid down and bring him in, dead or alive. It isn't long, however, before the Cisco Kid realizes that Sergeant Dunn is onto him. He starts formulating his own plan to outwit the sergeant. What makes In Old Arizona a fun movie to watch is that neither one of these characters are what you would call a villain. They're both very charming and very likable, and you instinctively want to see them both win. This only sucks you in even more, since you know that they're going to try to kill each other, but you want to see them both make it out okay. In addition, it also does a good job at setting up their conflict. They don't hate each other, if anything they have respect for each other, but it's still the nature of the game that they're going to be enemies. I especially love this opening scene where the two meet without knowing who the other is, and they actually hit it off. Unfortunately, In Old Arizona runs into the same problem that Sunrise: A Song of Two Humans did, in that it grinds to a screeching halt about halfway through the movie. At a certain point, the Cisco Kid goes off to hang out with his lover, Tonya Maria, played by Dorothy Burgess. Now at first, these scenes are enjoyable. They get you to like the Cisco Kid more as you see what exactly he robs for, and the two do have good chemistry. Or, good chemistry by 1929 standards. The problem is that we spend probably about a quarter of the movie's running time with these two just saying how much they love each other. Even when it comes back to Sergeant Dunn, it's really not interesting. He just meets up with some people, talks about his life, and then it drags on some more. Even when something does happen to advance us closer to the showdown, it really doesn't feel fully developed. Like, take this scene for example. A trio of cattle rustlers recognize the Cisco Kid and start tracking him so they can collect the bounty on his head. Now in any other movie, the subplot would take a little bit of time to, flesh out the rustlers, have them come up with a good plan, and get us invested so that way when they fail, it establishes the Cisco Kid as being dangerous. Instead, they're introduced, established, and killed all in the span of literally 3 minutes. Yeah, I timed it. Meanwhile, there's a scene that's at least twice as long where Sergeant Dunn talks to a bartender that he met in New York once and they reminisce together. What's the point? You could cut this part out and nothing would change. Also, I should probably mention some of that good old classic Hollywood whitewashing. Now you might think that through the shitty accent and pencil mustache, the film is trying to get away with casting an obviously white man as a Hispanic. But they actually do get around that by saying that the Cisco Kid is supposed to be Portuguese. Granted, I don't think the actor is Portuguese either, but still, at least he's white. Though the same can't be said for Tonya Maria. I highly doubt that woman has even a drop of Hispanic blood in her. So that's In Old Arizona. The two main characters are very likable, and the showdown, when it does arrive, is very suspenseful. It just takes such a long time to get there. Ugh. But it does have its moments, and it did kick off the Cisco Kid film series. I don't think that's one of the definitive old school movie franchises like, Tarzan or Sherlock Holmes or whatever, but still lasted 22 years and 25 films, so it probably did something right. Anyway, moving on to some other films, these Academy Awards are interesting in that this is the only year where one of the nominees for Outstanding Picture has become a lost film, that being The Patriot. For those of you who don't know what a lost film is, basically, in the early years of Hollywood, people honestly didn't care about preservation, and they would usually just destroy any of the original copies of their films after the theatrical runs ended. This was usually done to save storage space, or sometimes they were drunk and they had nothing better to do. True story, by the way. In addition, the original negatives that came out of the camera were shot on film nitrate, which is very flammable, and would often spontaneously combust into giant plumes of hellfire that would engulf any other reels of film that were nearby. Luckily, there was an easy way to avoid this, by simply storing the nitrate properly in a low humidity, low heat environment. And given that this was Hollywood in the roaring 20s, a decade that's well known for its spore site, filled with producers who don't give anything resembling a shit, it only stands to reason that they would do that and not store them in sun-baked storage sheds in the middle of 90-degree Los Angeles. In other words, many early films have been lost to fires. So many movies are like this that in fact, the Film Foundation estimates that 90% of all films made before 1929 are lost forever. That's a really scary number. As a result, a lot of these old movies are being rediscovered all the time from people who kept their theatrical reels. Hell, I think Wings was actually considered lost for a long time until someone found a reel in Paris sometime in the 90s, allowing them to restore it. Sadly, this fate has yet to visit the Patriot. All that remains of this film is some choice clips and a trailer. It's a real shame too, because looking at the trailer and reading the plot, it seems like it was a good movie. So if by any chance you recognize these clips from an old film reel you have lying around your basement, send it to the Library of Congress, they've been looking for it. Another movie I can't watch is Lights of New York. Not because it's lost, mind you, but because it's extremely rare and hard to find. It's not on Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hulu, or YouTube, nowhere else online, and the only DVD copy I could find is part of an old movie box set that would cost me about $400. The only way I'd be able to watch it is by waiting for it to show up on TCM, at which point I need to jury-rig my TV to record it, and yeah, I really don't have the time to wait for that. Still, I do need to mention this film because it was the first feature-length talkie. Like, the Jazz Singers just had talking segments. This is the first movie that had characters talking from beginning to end. If nothing else, that makes it one of the most noteworthy films of all time. It came out in July of 1929, which some of you may notice is actually outside the time brackets of both of the first two Academy Awards. The first one ends at May, while the second begins in August. That's 2 whole months without consideration. See, I was about to criticize the Academy for this oversight and therefore not even considering this film, but, well, here's the thing. From the critical reviews I could dig up on Lights of New York and the few clips I saw, the movie isn't what you would call very, what's the word I'm looking for here? Good? By all accounts, it's nothing more than a really crappy B-movie that just made a ton of money because it was the first movie to have people talk. Still, I do make it a point to not criticize any movies I haven't seen, so I don't know. Maybe I'm being too harsh on it, but I don't think this movie was ever going to win any Academy Awards. Moving on to the next movie, apparently this was the year that Westerns started becoming a big deal since The Wind came out during that time period as well. The Wind is widely regarded as one of the best silent films of all time, and yeah, I can agree with that. It revolves around a young woman named Letty, played by Lillian Gish, who moves out to a town in the Mojave Desert. There she exists as a fish out of water who must navigate the entourage of characters she meets, not all of whom are as friendly as they appear. Hey, it's like they always say, Mojave, no problems. This movie uses the environment to its fullest advantage, turning the windswept desert into as much of a villain as, well, the actual villain. Even if you can't actually hear the loud winds that drive her crazy, you still feel their presence, which isn't an easy thing to do for something that you can't see like wind. The limited sets only add to the sense of claustrophobia, and the result is simply wonderful. If I have any problems with The Wind, I'll admit that they're not problems with the movie itself, but just in how I watched it. The movie is old enough that it's now in the public domain, which means that anyone can broadcast it however they want, as many times as they want, without having to pay any royalties. As a result, the version that I watched was from some dude on Dailymotion who muted the restoration soundtrack in exchange for what I assume was his own band operating out of his parents' garage. The result? Well, you tell me. Yeah, that music really doesn't fit, does it? Hell, if you're going to make your own soundtrack for The Wind, you might as well have gone with this. All jokes aside, The Wind is easily one of the best movies that year. Unfortunately, it was doomed to a weak box office and eventual loss of the Academy Award since it came out at the dawn of the sound era. On the flip side, however, it has gained a good following and, like I said, is often considered one of the best silent films ever made. If you're a fan of silent movies, it's worth checking out. Just make sure that whatever asshole gives it to you doesn't also try to sell you CDs of his Nirvana cover. As long as we're here, I might as well round out the reviews of all the Outstanding Picture nominees with the Hollywood review of 1929. Now, for the record, going forward, this isn't going to be like this, as I try to review the noteworthy films that came out the year of the Academy Awards to ascertain whether or not they were snubbed, not just the movies that actually got nominated. If I only reviewed the movies that were nominated, there'd be several years where you'd hear me complain about a bunch of crap for 4 reviews in a row. It just so happens that this year, I thought all the nominees were worth talking about. Anyway, the Hollywood review of 1929 is, well, it's a review. Basically just a gala or a banquet with a master of ceremonies who introduces a bunch of segments with the best and brightest in Hollywood at the time. Because as you'll find out, if there's one thing that people in Hollywood love, it's movies about people in Hollywood. This is no different than if you just went to a banquet or a gala on your own time, which makes me wonder what the hell is the point of even watching this? The only thing that makes it something that you wouldn't be able to see on your own are some special effects. I mean, it accomplishes what it set out to do, I guess, but I really don't get why this would have been considered one of the front runners for Outstanding Picture that year. Well, okay, I know why. It's because the same people who appeared in the movie were the ones who were in the actual Academy, but this is just so... nothing. There's not much to it, especially watching it so many years later. But to get to our real snub of the day, we need to travel a little bit. Let's go from Hollywood, through the Great Plains, up the East Coast, and across the Atlantic Ocean to Paris, France, to look at a silent movie called The Passion of Joan of Arc, known in French as La Passion de Jeanne d'Arc. If I totally butchered that pronunciation, good, because I was trying to. Now, if we want to get technical, this was actually released in Denmark in April of 1928, and then France in October 1928, and didn't make its way stateside until March 1929. According to the Academy's rules on when a film can be considered, especially when they don't premiere locally, they have to have had their premiere in the city of Los Angeles during the eligibility period. Which I think is a fair rule. I mean, the Academy is based in Los Angeles after all. So while this movie was actually a 1928 film, it didn't come to Los Angeles until 1929. Therefore, we're looking at it for the second Academy Awards. The Passion of Joan of Arc details the final hours of Joan of Arc, played by Renée Falconetti, specifically her trial by the British clergy for heresy. In fact, the movie begins right as the trial does, which is a little bit of a problem. I don't know if in France Joan of Arc is such a folk hero that every single detail of her story is well known, but still, a quick little reminder at the beginning of the film would have been nice, explaining everything up to this point. Most older movies usually have that, even ones that don't require exposition, like The Wind. Why didn't they do that with this one? Well, whatever, I'm getting off track. Back to the story. Actually, there's not much more to the plot than that. It's just the trial of Joan of Arc as the clergy constantly tries to get her to renounce her faith in God, and it's basically the story of one woman's undying faith and loyalty to both her country and her religion. But what people remember about this movie is the style and how revolutionary it was. As you have probably noticed by now, the film pioneered the usage of close-ups in movies. Almost every single shot in the movie is a close-up, and it helps create a very hostile and tense atmosphere, and it instinctively puts you on the edge of your seat. In addition, very little makeup was used on the actors, and they were often shown in harsh lighting. Consequently, the actors were far more uglied up than they usually were, and it gives the movie a much more realistic feel. Like, isn't that judge so much more menacing when you can see all of his wrinkles and warts? Also, the acting was far more subtle than most people were used to, especially for a silent film. I mean, look at Joan. She rarely screams or cries in the movie, and when she does, it's very subdued. In any other silent movie, or hell, any movie coming out at that time period in general, this would have been far more overplayed. Instead, they play it much more subtly, which makes it a lot more realistic, which makes it a lot more powerful. This movie was very ahead of its time in that way. I also have to mention the music in this film. When this movie was doing its theatrical run, it actually had no sound. Instead, the music would have been performed by an orchestra live. Luckily, the people who restored the movie redid the orchestration as they thought it would have been. As you can hear, it must have been some really epic shit. Hearing this live would have been incredible. Combines to make a film that was instantly hailed as a masterpiece when it came out, and still remains a really great experience to this day. Though that's not to say that it's perfect by any means. Like I said, it does kind of just throw you into the story, and sometimes the style can backfire on the movie in a really bad way. The clips you've been watching, I haven't been cherry picking to show off the close-ups. When I said that almost every single shot in this movie is a close-up, I mean almost every single shot is a close-up. And that's really not a good thing. Close-ups are meant to be used as an exclamation point when it comes to filmmaking. Like, it either accentuates the mood you're feeling, or it creates a hostile atmosphere. Usually both. Now, this does work for most of the scenes in the movie, but not all of them. Like, look at this opening scene when Joan is meeting the judges for the first time. This doesn't need to be all extreme close-ups because the judges aren't angry with her yet, they just want to meet her. This could have, and should have, been done with medium shots. It especially sticks out like a sore thumb in this scene where Joan is visited by a kindly priest played by Galbert Dalu. Now, this is supposed to be a nice scene, a brief reprieve before the movie gets intense again, where Joan meets someone who's on her side. Having it all close-ups doesn't work here. He's not an antagonist, so the scene isn't supposed to be harsh and hostile, and thus it just feels weird more than anything else. There's not much in the way of establishing shots either. Not every scene begins with a shot showing where each character is in relation to each other, leaving you to guess where they all are. And when they do, they're often a blink and you'll miss them kind of moment. Or they're shot like this. This isn't artistic or cool, it's annoying. All it does is make me want to reach into my TV and pull the camera down. God damn it! Learn how to frame a fucking shot, you decadent Danish dipshits! Ugh! Those issues aside, The Passion of Joan of Arc is one of the last great silent films, and has influenced many later filmmakers, as well as set the standard for modern acting decades before this would become the norm. On top of that though, it's still a great movie. Yeah, those issues I mentioned do detract from it a little bit, but you know what, it's still pretty epic. Also, fun fact, this was considered a lost film for a long time too, before someone found an old reel in an insane asylum in Norway. Isn't that amazing to think about? But could it be called the best picture of that year? Well, if you remember my last video where I talked about the Broadway Melody and how it told movie audiences that threatening to rape someone is a perfectly okay flirting tactic to get them to like you, yeah. I'm just going to go ahead and label this a snub. Even taking The Passion of Joan of Arc out of the equation, The Wind was also a much better film than the Broadway Melody. But The Passion of Joan of Arc wasn't even nominated for Outstanding Picture. It could have very easily replaced the Hollywood Review as one of the top 5 that year. So why didn't it? Well, this is getting into one of the main criticisms that people have had about the Academy over the years, that being that they're very self-centric. By that I mean that the Academy is made up of people in Hollywood, so the movies that they consider pretty much always come out of Hollywood. And if they want to branch out onto the independent circuit, which they almost never do, it's still very American-based. Think about it, when was the last time you saw a non-English movie win the Oscar for Best Picture? Or any of the other major awards like Best Actor or Best Director? Well, I'll save you some research time. It's never happened. Not once. Now, to be fair, America is the capital of the global movie industry. I'm not saying that to be nationalistic, it's just a fact. The only country that comes close is India with Bollywood, and even then, their films don't gross nearly as much or as renowned on the world stage as America. So I can understand a large majority of movies being American-based on a yearly basis, but still, there's 194 other countries in this world. Odds are that over the course of a century, at least one of them made the best movie that year, and this is a prime example of this happening. There are definitely worse snubs out there, but this one is worth homing in on for one of the most significant flaws of the Academy. Although, if we're being fair, I don't know if the Academy was yet at the point where they considered themselves the caretakers of the art, and the Academy Awards were more transparently Hollywood-based. If this is the case, then I can understand the reasoning a little bit more. But even with that in mind, The Wind was a much better film than the Broadway Melody. On the other hand, however, both The Wind and The Passion of Joan of Arc were silent movies in the time of sound, so maybe they were being seen as already a little bit outdated during the awards. But just the previous year they had the awards made specifically to stop sound movies, so I don't know. I'm just going around in circles at this point. This was a snub, plain and simple. See you guys at the next video.
Extreme close up! Wow!